This, as we've seen, is the image of the welfare queen. She helped to bring us so-called welfare reform in the 1990s. Now, before we talk about what those laws did and why it matters, let's talk a little bit about the history of cash aid to poor women with children. What we now think of as welfare cash aid to poor women with children emerged most systematically in the Progressive era as what were called widows' pensions programs or mothers' pension programs. And these were efforts to solve a significant problem of the industrial age. In a world in which middle-class white women were not expected or sometimes even permitted to work, what was to be done with those women who did what convention told them to, got married, had children, and cared for their home, if their husband died? Now, especially before the advent of workplace safety and health regulations, lots of men did die at work, perhaps 35,000 a year then, compared to about 4,600 in 2012. These pension programs were the answer, and they were specifically designed so that middle-class white women would not have to work, but could stay home and care for their children. Illinois created the first of these in 1911, and there were versions in 46 states by 1934. So as with much of the New Deal, these state-level programs were then nationalized in the 1930s, made into a shared federal-state program called Aid to Dependent Children. It was Title IV of the Social Security Act of 1935. And the goal here, too, was to make it possible for widows with children to remain home and care for their children if their husband died. So the program was structured to discourage work, to make it possible to not have to work. Now, as you can see here, this was a small, limited program until about the 1960s, in large measure because it was designed to award benefits only to the most deserving women, and thus excluded many of the women most in need of aid, and that was black women living in the South. So it achieved that goal in a number of ways. Suitable home rules allowed enormous discretion for discrimination. It allowed caseworkers to make their own determinations about whether a woman applying for aid was maintaining a morally upright household suitable for the rearing of children and thus deserving of aid. Man in the House rules forbade men from living with women on ADC or later AFDC for puritanical moral reasons, I think, to be sure, but also to prevent cash aid for mothers from going to men who, it was presumed, should be working and supporting those women. Now, these rules, and others were enforced by midnight raids, in which caseworkers would show up unannounced at all hours and search for evidence of a man. And if they found any, aid would be cut off. So notice how the program, because of its very structure and intent, discouraged two-parent households. Yet notice that in later years, women on welfare would be blamed for not being partnered with a man. Now, all of this was made possible because, unlike Social Security, which was a fully national program with national rules and regulations administered through Washington, D.C., ADC was a shared federal-state program that awarded lots of discretion to the states. This was the price that FDR paid for Southern Democrats' support of the SSA, just as other provisions of the Act excluded agricultural and domestic workers to keep blacks off the rolls and therefore make them more desperate and more dependent on the local labor market. But the rolls eventually were more open to black women. Now, first, the Second Great Migration meant that more African American women were living in the North rather than the South, and while there was plenty of discrimination in the North, make no mistake, there was less, and it was easier for poor African American women in the North to get access to the rolls. So that opened up the program a bit. Further, thanks to activism of poor women throughout the United States, often operating under the banner of the National Welfare Rights Organization, local relief agencies were pressured to be more responsive to poor women, and especially poor women of color. So that opened up the rolls a bit too. Meanwhile, Thanks to the creation of legal aid and other war on poverty initiatives that gave poor people access to lawyers and the courts, discrimination cases were brought and won, further opening up the rolls to women previously excluded. And finally, the United States Supreme Court steps in with three important decisions. King versus Smith in 1968, which strikes down those suitable home requirements. Shapiro versus Thompson, also 1968, which doesn't permit states to deny benefits if you've just moved into a city or the state. And then Goldberg versus Kelly in 1970, which creates an administrative right to everyone who was denied benefits to get a fair hearing to contest their case. All of these events taken together wind up forcing ADC and then AFDC, then a change of the program in 1963, to grant benefits to poor women who had been unfairly denied aid. Now, because the women who had been excluded were disproportionately black, as the rolls expanded in the 1960s, most of those new entrants were black. This played right into the hands of those who would exploit racial tensions for gain and was portrayed as a crisis, especially since many of these new recipients were not only widows, but had never been married in the first place. This set the stage for what Lucy Williams has called a 30-year assault on welfare, in which, as we've seen, welfare becomes racialized, and politicians persuade people to worry that welfare is the urgent problem we need to address rather than poverty. And that culminates in the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunities Reconciliation Act of 1996, what we've come to call welfare reform.